I'm delighted to warmly welcome back to the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies the Foreign Minister of the Sultanate of Oman, His Excellency Sayyid Badr al-Busaidi.
Assalamu alaikum. There's no way that I can avoid talking to you about current developments in Palestine, in particular, since the Hamas attack of October the 7th and the 4 months of Israel's invasion of Gaza that have followed. I can't but take a moment with a heavy heart to remember and pray for all of the innocent souls that have fallen and continue to fall indiscriminately and hopelessly in Palestine. I genuinely believe that a solution to the question of Palestine can and must be found. But to achieve this, there needs to be a transformation in our thinking, a transformation that is long overdue. There's a tendency to think and act as though the world can be neatly organized into two. There are friends and enemies, there's good and evil, an axis of evil on the one hand and the guardians of prosperity on the other. Let me ask, why do we do this? Why do we want the world to be so black and white? It's like trying to capture an ocean in a teacup. I think this comes from a failure to come to terms with the reality of a multipolar world. I'm afraid history has moved on faster than we have, and we need to catch up with history. Over 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, too many of us still inhabit a Cold War mentality of binary opposition, zero-sum games, and elective non-communication. Far too many talk mainly to their friends and make it a point of principle to refuse to talk to those people that they define as their enemies. And this is a serious impediment, a self-inflicted disability. And so, confronted with the horrifying human catastrophe in Gaza, there is a refusal to do the one thing that might open up a pathway to peace. Hamas cannot be eradicated. So if there is ever to be peace, I think the peacemakers will have to find a way to talk to them and to listen. This will require a transformation in thinking and the development of forms of practical diplomacy that are suitable for a multipolar world, in which we all have to learn to talk to anyone, for the good of everyone. This will involve breaking what for many has been the habit of a lifetime, Nowhere is this true than in the part of the world I live in, where lives have been blighted by the curse of sectarianism. In the sectarian vision of the region, communities and cultures are supposed to be based on sharp divisions. Divisions between Sunni and Shia, between Muslims and Jews, between Muslims and Christians. And politics in this vision is shaped and driven by these identities. You hear talk of age-old communal tensions and historical antagonisms and ancient and enduring animosities. The use of this language assumes that the people of the region are acting primarily because of their identities. They are simply following the sectarian script. They are not capable of making the kind of independent and sophisticated judgments that the people of the democratic West are used to making. This is the toxic character of a sectarian logic. Once it is introduced, it reproduces itself as if spontaneously, as though it was something natural. But it is not natural. It is historical. Sectarian thinking may have dominated much of the history of the last 100 years in our region, but it has not always been this way. I believe the decisive moment of its emergence as the dominant logic of the region came at the very same time at which the Cold War was just beginning to shape global relations. That moment involved the settlement of Palestine by Jewish people of European origin, and in due course, their foundation of the State of Israel. Now, I want to be very careful and very precise in what I say here. The foundation of this State of Israel was not in itself a problem. The problem was that it introduced into an emergent modern Arab political landscape a new emphasis on religion as the basis for national identity. As Zionists started to arrive, they brought with them a European nationalist project conceived in Europe to be realized in Palestine. It did not have its roots in the region, and nor did it appreciate the ecumenical character of the region's political and intellectual culture. For Zionism, if it is nothing else, it is a movement that insists upon the right of Jews to live in a Jewish state. This would eventually come to mean that after 1948, it would become more and more difficult for someone to define themselves as an Arab Jew. For the Zionists, the Arabs were the obstacles to the achievement of their political objective, the Jewish state. This binary polarization was intensified because many of the Arab leaders who most strongly asserted their hostility towards Israel were also those who took their countries into political alliances with the Soviet Union. So the poison of religious sectarianism was compounded by the confrontation of the Cold War. This is what gives many people the impression that today's crisis is the result of ancient antagonisms between religious communities. The reality is that today's antagonism may now have a powerful sectarian dimension, but they do so only because of what happened in the middle of the last century. And what's more, when we look more closely at today's reality, the sectarian dimension turns out not to be quite as powerful as many think it is. Because it turns out that even today, in a world supposedly riven with sectarian conflicts and hostilities, the reality is more complicated. In Lebanon, a country like Lebanon today, for example, it is Hezbollah which has mobilized its forces and taken military action against Israel. Hezbollah, we are told, is a Shia party, and it functions as a proxy for Iran. And that is supposed to explain what is happening. But it stops short of any actual explanation. In reality, Hezbollah enjoys significant popular and political support within Lebanon for its stance. That support comes from across the religious spectrum and includes not just Sunni Muslims, but also Christians. This support is a matter of political choice, not sectarian fidelity. The people of the region have minds, by the way. They do have minds of their own and make political judgments rather than just mindlessly adhering to sectarian affiliation. And it is really deeply offensive to suggest otherwise. This denigration of a widely shared political perspective is what I call the sectarian slander. I'm not saying that the people represented in Western media as the bad guys are really the good guys. That's just the same kind of binary thinking. What I'm saying is that bad and good just aren't helpful categories when trying to make sense of a complex and dynamic situation and act responsibly within it. There are all kinds of different players with different interests and different perspectives. And so only if you talk to them and listen to them can you find out what their interests and perspectives really are, and start to work out how to engage deeply with them. And this has to be the basis on which we halt the catastrophe today in Gaza and in Palestine. And it has to be the basis for diplomacy in a multipolar world. Sometimes you may need to pretend not to be talking to people when in reality you are. And I would like to believe and to think that such conversations are happening today. That behind the bluster, there is some dialogue. But I fear in the present crisis, I don't think anyone is pretending not to talk. Even we, softly spoken Omanis, attract criticism from friends for saying that we need to talk to Hamas rather than eradicate them. And for those who obsess about their rejectionist stance, I would simply quote the Hamas Charter of 2017. It's here. It says, Hamas considers the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital along the lines of the 4th of June 1967, with the return of the refugees and the displaced to their homes from which they were expelled, to be a formula of national consensus. This is a reasonable starting point for negotiation. I'm going to end with a series of concrete and pragmatic proposals for some international action. First, we need an emergency international conference charged with agreeing arrangements for Palestinian statehood and establishing mechanisms for its implementation. The world has deferred the question of Palestine statehood for far too long. Too many of those who speak today in favor of a two-state solution regard this as an objective to be achieved in some distant future, as though in that future the fundamental realities will have magically changed to make possible then what is somehow not possible now. So I say, no more deferral. We have to deal with the reality we inhabit, and we have to deal with it now. And that reality includes a movement or an organization like Hamas. The international conference will have to include them too. Second, this conference must be convened by leaders of a range of countries, a range properly representative of the global majority. I say this because I'm concerned that the present crisis is deepening divisions between the global South and the global North. And the last thing needed is another false global division, just like the one constructed in the Cold War. And that is why we should make an international conference on Palestine urgently, and we should make it part of an urgent renewal of our commitment to genuine multilateralism. And this will require institutional reform. And this is my third proposal. The structure of the United Nations Security Council is a Cold War artifact And I don't think it is properly multilateral. Therefore, the veto is part of a zero-sum game, a zero-sum logic, and it should be removed. Sadly, we are now living in a world shaped by the people who killed Ishaq Rabin. But it is certainly not the only world possible. What I hope I have offered here today are ideas for repairing some of the damage that has been done over the last 30 years or indeed more. We can start that process now by taking urgent collective action to establish a Palestinian state. Not to start a process in which that objective is a distant goal, but to take practical steps to ensure that the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and the will of the international community are realized, and realized urgently. That's why, when I met David Cameron on January the 30th and January the 31st, I was heartened that he is now more to recognizing Palestinian statehood sooner rather than later. But I did urge him to turn words into action. And as he put it, build momentum now. The creation of a Palestinian state is an existential necessity. It is quite clear that only with the rights that sovereignty confers can the Palestinian people even hope to survive. Without a state, they are condemned to a perpetual threat of destitution, annihilation, and death. And it is only through the creation of a Palestinian state that we can hope to marginalize and eventually remove sectarian slander from the region. A just resolution of the Palestinian question is a necessary first step in a longer process of change for the people of the region. My vision as an Omani, as an Arab, as a Muslim, is that Palestinian statehood will allow us to see ourselves and to be seen alongside an Israeli state as people with complex social and cultural identities, rather than identified in terms of identities that are defined mostly in terms of religious affiliations. In other words, we can return to the hopeful path of the Arab Nahda, and one of its homes can be Jerusalem, Al-Quds. Thank you, and God bless you. Peace upon you.